Brandenburg Concerti are a set of 6 pieces composed by Johann Sebastian Bach between 1711 and 1720. The exact time frame of their composition is not well established, though they were dedicated in completed form in 1721 to the Margrave of Brandenburg, hence the name given to them, the Brandenburg Concertos. A Margrave was a noble title at the time, typically given to a prince. Bach's dedication to the Margrave has been called a thinly veiled job application, though I wouldn't even go so far as to say thinly veiled. The second sentence of his dedication reads, and I quote, "I very humbly beg your Royal Highness to have the goodness to maintain his kind favor toward me, and to be persuaded that I have nothing more at heart than to be able to be employed in some opportunities more worthy of him and of his service." In this video, I'm going to examine the third movement from Brandenburg Concerto No. 2. The goal of the video is to give enough context so that any particularly interested viewer will be able to follow and understand, even without a deep understanding of music history or theory. Any musical background will definitely be helpful though, and the video will get more in depth as it goes along. The concerti, plural for concerto, were composed nearer the end of the Western musical era known as Baroque, which ran from about 1600 to 1750. This piece, Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, Movement 3, epitomizes the Baroque style in a number of ways. First, a basso continuo is present. This is a hallmark of the Baroque era, and in modern terms, this could be thought of as a bass line that is ever present throughout a piece. Basso continuo also implies chords or a harmony above the bass line that a keyboard player or another string instrument player that's capable of producing chords would improvise or infer from the bass line. Here's the bass line, or basso continuo, from the first page of this piece. The text, violoncello e cembalo, is Italian and translates to cello and harpsichord. So in this instance, the cello would play the bass line as written, and the harpsichord would be improvising chords above the bass line. Here's how the bass line by itself sounds. Here's an arrangement of the bass line and chords above it by Michel Rondeau that demonstrates what would typically be played. Notice this bass line here, you can see, matches exactly what we have above. The difference, of course, is the chords in the staff above it. Secondly, the piece exhibits contrast as a dramatic element, which is another hallmark of Baroque-era music. Particularly, the contrast occurs with thinner textures versus thicker. And what I mean by this is it alternates between just a few instruments playing lightly and then every instrument kicking in and playing simultaneously. This increases the volume as well with everyone playing at once, which just enhances that contrast. For example, in this next snippet, you'll see a thinner texture lead into a thicker texture. This piece belongs to a category of music called Concerto Grosso, though, as we'll briefly explore, it doesn't stick to the stricter definitions of this term. In a standard Concerto Grosso, the piece is played by 2 groups of musicians that alternate. A smaller group of soloists, known as the concertino, and a typically larger group of supporting musicians called the ripieno. The basso continuo, we mentioned earlier is also present and typically supports the music, but is not considered part of the ripieno, and is typically considered its own thing. While the piece does have the two groups, the concertino and the ripieno, it does not adhere strictly to the paradigm of alternation between the two. If we look at our previous example, the concertino and the basso continuo play by themselves, which is to be expected, but then the ripieno kick in and everyone plays together. There are other examples of this throughout the piece as well that we'll see later. Though this piece contains some structural elements of concerto grosso, as outlined a moment ago, it closely follows a fugue pattern in musical form. A fugue is a piece that epitomizes a concept known as counterpoint. A good, succinct definition of counterpoint from the Oxford Music Online database is a term first used in the 14th century to describe the combination of simultaneously sounding musical lines according to a system of rules. What this means for a listener is that two or more separate melody lines will be playing at the same time. To demonstrate, I'll play a single melody line from the piece by itself, then I'll play another one, and then I'll play them together as they're written in the piece, so you can hear them separately and then together to get a good idea of exactly how this works. Here's our first melody line from the trumpet. Here's our second melody line. This is from the basso continuo, or the harpsichord / cello in this case. And finally, both of them playing together as they do in the piece. So, as we just saw, a fugue has multiple melody lines, at least two, possibly more. And as is the case with this particular piece, the melody lines can occur on different instruments, but they could also occur on the same instrument, as in, for example, a piano fugue. These different melody lines are identified by the term voice. So the two we just saw, you would consider each one its own voice. And so you can have 3-voice fugue, 2-voice fugue, and so on and so forth. So a fugue, strictly speaking, will have a main theme known as a subject that is repeated throughout the piece in these different voices, in different pitches generally, and sometimes different rhythm. The subject can be accompanied by what is known as a counter-subject, which is played by a different voice, a separate melody line. So if we look back to the example I just gave, the trumpet is playing the subject. The basso continuo is playing our counter subject. One other note about the subject is that the subject, if it's particularly long, like this one is, it can be divided into two sections. The beginning section is called the head, and the ending section is known as the tail. And so here, the beginning section starts at the beginning and runs till about the midway point, actually, as we might expect. And the tail section starts right where the head ends, and then it runs all the way to the end of our subject. So let's listen to them separately now. First, the head. And then the tail. I just want to discuss one other introductory topic briefly, and then I'm going to dive into looking at the piece itself. So, much like a modern song will have different sections, a verse, a chorus, a bridge, etc., a fugue also has typical sections that define it as a form. The exposition, as it's called, is an introductory section, where each voice will play the subject. The subject could be played at the same pitch each time, or on different pitches. So the initial playing of the subject is called the subject. But if we play it at a different pitch later, that's actually called an answer. So if we compare our previous example of the trumpet here to the oboe here, we can see and also hear that the oboe is playing it at a lower pitch, but it's still recognizable as the subject. And so that would be called an answer, and what the trumpet played would be called the subject. Before we move on from answers, I think it's important for the understanding of this piece as we go through it to get into the weeds a little bit more with answers and the different types of answers that exist. So let's look at the subject and answer side by side. It doesn't occur this way in the piece, but I've composited it together like this to more directly illustrate the point I'm trying to make. Here we have the flute and the violin. The violin has the subject, and the flute has the answer. If you compare the two lines, you can see that the notes look pretty much the same, except for that the notes in the flute are higher on the staff. This is an important thing to note, because that's what makes it an answer. So if we count the distance between the note here on the violin and the note here on the flute, and you count the spaces and lines in between them, we find that it's 5. This is a good basic way of measuring the distance between notes, called intervals. Intervals are typically represented with Roman numerals, so this one would be represented with a V. And we can measure any other interval with this same method as well. Now, in a lot of cases, there's a little more to it than simply counting the spaces and lines in between notes, but for our purposes, this will work fine. The only other thing I'd like to mention here, while we're on the subject, is the role of the 5 in Western music. For any given key, so in the instance of this piece, the key of F, the 5 is extremely important. It serves as kind of a propellant to push back towards the 1. So 1 is F, that makes 5 C. So if we were to hear a C chord in the context of this piece, it creates a type of tension that is only released by then playing the F chord, the 1. Here's a very quick example using a piano sound in the key of F. We'll first hear the F chord played twice, then the C chord played twice, and then back to the F chord. You'll notice that after the C chord plays in the second measure, we want to resolve it back to F. That demonstrates the function of the 5. And so this important role has a number of implications, but in this context, this is why we see this answer on 5. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the exposition, or introductory section, is just a playing of the subject or an answer in each of the voices of the fugue. In our case, the voices are just the concertino. The ripieno aren't introduced in the exposition and therefore wouldn't be considered voices for this fugue. Another section of a fugue is known as an episode. In the episodes, we typically don't hear a full subject or answer, though we may hear some material from it. But an episode is typically more free-flowing and unsettled or transitional. There will be modulations, key changes, where our tonal center seems to shift. We may switch from a major key to a minor key, or vice versa. All of these things typically happen in an episode. Then, if we come to another section where the subject seems to come back, either in just one voice or perhaps in several voices, this section would be known as an entry section. Again, this section will be less unsettled and free-flowing, unlike the episodes. And this is kind of the basic construction of a fugue, switching between episodes and entry sections. With all that in mind, let's listen to some of the piece now. I'm going to play the exposition and see if you can identify the different entries, the different subject and answer playings. You will notice that during this exposition, there's going to be a break where we aren't playing the subject or an answer. This is called a codetta, and it's basically a very small episode that's put into the exposition section where there's some free-flowing material. So here's the exposition. There are a couple of things that occurred in the exposition that I'd like to touch on before moving on. First, as you may have noticed, the answers were labeled as real answers on 5. This has to do with the distance between the notes, the intervals, in the answer itself. So previously, we had compared the subject to an answer on 5 and the distance between those notes. But the distance between the notes within the answer itself determine what type of answer it is. If they're the same distance as the distances in the subject, then we call this a real answer. It'll look exactly like the subject, except shifted up or down on the staff. This contrasts with a tonal answer. A tonal answer will have some of the intervals modified, but it's similar enough to be recognized as an answer. The other thing worth noting that occurs in the exposition occurs at the very beginning of the codetta. A motive is introduced first by the flute and then immediately played again by the trumpet. This motive is worth noting because it occurs throughout the piece. I'll play a quick sample of it, isolated on the trumpet. The second part of this motive, the rapid 16th note portion is something of a sequence. A sequence is a motive that's played several times in increasing or decreasing pitch levels so that it moves up and down the key in rapid succession. This lends itself to the more transitory nature of an episode, and that's why we see it here in the codetta. We'll see this motive used later in episodes in much the same way. So next, let's keep moving through the piece and look at the first episode. It's rather short, but there's a few things worth noting in it. So first I'll play it, and then we'll look at it in a little more detail. So, a few interesting things happened in that episode. One you may have already noticed is there was a sequence that occurred. The interesting thing about this sequence is that the flute and the violin were sort of bouncing back and forth, passing inverse melody lines to one another. We'll go through the episode again and highlight this. Another thing that you might have noticed is we start seeing accidentals here. They actually started a little bit earlier towards the end of our exposition, but they're very prominent here in the episode. An accidental is a modifier symbol that goes next to a note on the staff that instructs the player to play the note higher or lower. I won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but for our purposes, the accidentals do tell us something. They tell us that we might be changing key, or at least emphasizing a key other than the original key that we were just playing in, which is F. In this case, the accidental serves to emphasize the key of C. Our accidental here is a natural sign, and it's occurring on the B note. So instead of playing B flat, we are now playing B natural. B natural serves as the leading tone of C. A short definition of a leading tone is that in the right context, it pushes us towards a particular note. So B being the leading tone of C means that B leads to C. So the introduction of these natural signs indicates that we're trying to lead to C. If you recall from the discussion earlier about the 5, C is the 5 of F. So what we're doing in this episode is we're trying to push to the 5 of our original key. This is confirmed most strongly by the end of the episode, where a cadence to C occurs. A cadence is a harmonic mechanism that's used to conclude a phrase, but it's also a very effective and often used way of moving the piece to a new tonal center or key. So in this instance, it's moving to 5. I'm going to play this episode one more time at a much slower tempo and highlight a few of these things that we discussed and see if you can hear at the end of the episode the sort of conclusive feeling that gets us to our new entry section when the trumpet kicks in and plays an answer in C. So now, thanks to that little episode and the cadence at the end of it, we're firmly in the key of C, the 5 of our original key of F. So the piece from this point moving forward until we change again is going to be in the key of C. After this episode, we have a very brief entry section with the trumpet playing a tonal answer on 5. Just to quickly recap on that term, tonal, that means that the intervals within the answer are going to be different from how they appear in the subject. So this is a tonal answer, not a real answer. I'll play this brief clip with the highlighting in place, and then we'll move on. As I mentioned, that was a very brief entry section. We're already back into another episode. I'll play this episode first with some interesting things highlighted and then discuss them in a little more detail after. So we saw a couple of interesting things in this episode. First, the ripieno start actually playing. This is the first time they've come in the piece. Here they're primarily providing harmonic support. We also see a new motive that's being used. Much like the motive that's introduced in the codetta, it's used in sequential form, and we will see it again later in the piece as well. Here's that motive isolated. As the highlighting showed, it started by the oboe first, and then the trumpet and violin start playing it the very next measure. So the trumpet and violin are playing it in unison, offset by one measure to the oboe. Finally, we also see the introduction of a new accidental. This one only occurs a handful of times, and this one is F sharp. In this context, F sharp is serving as the leading tone of G. But we don't switch completely to the key of G. This is known as tonicizing. It's similar to modulating to another key, but it's not as strong and it's not final. We just sort of emphasize the other key briefly. Or more accurately, we're emphasizing a particular chord or note in our current key. So the F sharp is emphasizing G, which is the 5 of C. With C being our current key, we're emphasizing the 5. But since this is a tonicization, we're only emphasizing it. We're not going to it. And so the 5 is used at the end of our episode to create another cadence back to 1, or C. For this next entry section, I do want to mention one thing, that we're going to hear a tonal answer on C, and this is going to be labeled in the sheet music as a tonal answer on 5. But what I'm referring to here is 5 of the original key of F. So C is the 5 of F. If we were looking at it from our current key context, it would be a tonal answer on 1. But it's better to relate this back to the original key and the original subject when we're talking about answers. So I know the concept can be a little confusing at first, but basically we're getting a tonal answer of 5 of the original key, not 5 of our new key, which would be G if that were the case. So here's the entry section with necessary highlighting, and we'll discuss it afterward. So that was another quick entry section with a tonal answer on 5. What's interesting here isn't necessarily the answer itself, but what happens after it as it enters the next episode. The tail of the tonal answer doesn't really complete. It just bleeds into a series of sequencing 16th notes that brings us directly into our episode. The episode is really short, but accomplishes something in that short period of time that I'd like to touch on before we move on. So I'm going to play the episode through with some highlighting, and then we'll pause again and discuss it. So, in this brief episode, we have a couple of new concepts introduced. The first you'll see at the far left is the pivot chord. Up until this point, I haven't been talking too much about chords or harmony specifically, but I think now's a good time to introduce this. I mentioned earlier the importance of the 5, also known as the dominant, and the importance of the 5 isn't just in terms of the interval, the 5, so the note F to the note C, for example, but of equal or more importance is the chord itself. You may recall the chord example I gave of playing the 1 twice, the 5 twice, and then back to the 1 to demonstrate the role of the 5 chord. So we aren't just limited to a 5, of course. We can count up to any other note in the scale and find a chord based on that note and give it a Roman numeral value. Given that a particular scale will have 7 different notes, we can have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then it resets back over to the 1 again, just an octave higher. These chords all have their own role to play and their own particular sound, depending on the key and the quality, major or minor. But as this isn't really a course on tonal harmony, I'm not going to dive into that too much more, except to say that, like keys, chords can be major and minor as well. And they have a particular sound depending on whether they're major or minor, just like a key would. If the chord is major, we would write the Roman numeral capitalized, and if the chord's minor, we would write it lowercase. And the same actually goes for key names. So you can see the uppercase C here for C major and D, M lowercase for D minor. There's also other types of chords, and we actually see one here in our episode, a diminished chord. That's the lowercase Roman numeral 7 with the degree sign above it, which would be C sharp diminished. Diminished chords sound very tense or dissonant, and they serve a couple of purposes. We can say, in this case, they serve a purpose very similar to the 5 chord in that they want to resolve to the 1. So its presence here just sort of reinforces that motion to the new 1, D minor. So here, when you see pivot chord, and then C:5 and DM:4, what this is referring to is this measure harmonically encompasses the 5 chord of C, which is G, but it also encompasses the 4 chord of D minor. To put it another way, just simply count up from D, D, E, F, G, 4. Likewise, C, D, E, F, G, 5. So these two keys, C major and D minor, share this chord in common, just in different roles. And so a pivot chord, it takes advantage of this commonality. Specifically here, Bach is taking advantage of this to get us from the key of C major to the key of D minor. We can't say for certain right at the pivot chord that this is definitely the case, but if we progress along just a little further, we'll start seeing another accidental, which is highlighted. This is C sharp. This triggers the thought that, okay, we're no longer having C, but C sharps. So we can't very well be in the key of C. It doesn't make a lot of sense to be in the key of C, but play C sharps instead of C. So that tells us right away we're probably going to be moving to another key. C sharp just so happens to be the leading tone of D. There's one other thing we need to figure out, though, because both of these things are true for both D major and D minor. They would both have a pivot chord of G, maybe G major, and they could both have a leading tone of C sharp. Now, there are a few different kinds of minor scales. There's harmonic, there's melodic, and there's natural. We can rule out the natural minor scale right away because the natural doesn't have a leading tone. Now, the harmonic and melodic minor scale both have a leading tone, in this case C sharp, but the difference between the two is that the melodic minor scale will have a raised sixth. So if we count up from D, D, E, F, G, A, B, B is the 6th scale degree of the D major or minor scale. However, in the minor scale, this would actually be B flat, not B natural. So if we were to raise the 6th scale degree of the minor scale, we would raise it from B flat to B natural, which is just regular B. So in this case, we see the accidental of B natural already, thanks to having been in C major. This means that our sixth scale degree is raised, and we have a leading tone. So our candidates for keys has just reduced down to two, either D major or D melodic minor. The final thing we need to do to identify the key that we're actually going to is to look at the third scale degree. In D major, it should be F sharp. In any of the D minors, but in this case the D melodic minor, it would just be F. We don't see any F sharps here, and so by the power of deduction, we figured out that we are most likely going to D minor or D melodic minor. For analytical and labeling purposes, it's sufficient just to say D minor. Now, we could have just shortcutted much of this technical explanation, and by just listening to this section, we can tell that we're entering a minor key just by how it sounds. Songs in a minor key are typically described as sad, dark, mysterious, etc. And it definitely seems to adopt those qualities. After that point, we would just need to determine which minor key it is. But I've done that here already, and so we're now firmly in the key of D minor. Okay, that was a large detour, so let's get back to listening to the piece, if I haven't already bored you to sleep. Up next is our entry section in D minor. So, we see in this entry section a pattern that we've maybe come to expect. We hear a tonal answer on 6, which in this case is the current key of D minor, so it's the 1 of the current key. But as I mentioned before, we want to relate it back to the original subject. Then we hear a tonal answer on 5 of our current key, which is 3 of the original key. Notice here the lowercase Roman numerals, which, as mentioned, just indicate that they're all minor. One final interesting thing to note about the answer on 3 or 5 of D minor is that it's played by the basso continuo and the lowest voice of the ripieno. This is a tad unexpected, given that the exposition established that the only voices of the fugue were the concertino. Finally, notice also that the concept of contrast as a dramatic element comes into play very notably here. Our tonal answer on 6 had a much thinner texture, with the ripieno not playing, but when our answer on 3 kicks in, you can just hear the more dramatic nature of it after everyone's playing together. Now, let's move on and listen to this next episode with the necessary highlighting in place. So, quite a lot happened in that episode. Let's go through it again, step by step, and discuss it a little bit. The first thing we notice here is that the C sharps start going away and another accidental appears, E flat. So this tells us something is going to happen with the key or the tonal center, but we aren't sure yet. Then we see the motive that first occurred in the first episode come back. Then we see quite a lot of E flats, and we see a couple of F sharps show up. So what's happening here is that it's tonicizing G minor. As you may recall from the second episode, tonicization means we're just emphasizing another key or tonal center without fully committing to it. And the way Bach does this is by first, as mentioned, introducing the E flats. So now we have B flat and E flat playing. And if you recall from our discussion on minor keys, in the harmonic minor, the third and the sixth will be lowered. So B is the third of G, G, A, B. So that becomes B flat, and that's lowered. And E is the sixth, and so that becomes E flat, and so that's lowered. And then we have F sharp present here, which is the leading tone to G. And so those things combined tell us that we're tonicizing G minor. Shortly after this, though, the C sharps come back and the E flats go away. The presence of C sharp and F sharp and the lack of B flat and the lack of any other flats briefly implies the key of D major, which we were just in D minor, and it's sort of hinting at D major, but we don't end up making any meaningful moves in that direction. Then our motive that was first introduced in the codetta makes a return, and we sequence through the episode a little more, where we lose the F sharp again, and we gain the E flats again shortly thereafter. Should also mention that at this point we've stopped seeing B naturals, so we're playing B flats again from our key signature. The second motive makes a reappearance again, descending down through what appears to be B flat major. We haven't had a cadence yet, but the accidentals E flat and B flat match what we would expect to find in B flat major. We find our cadence shortly after the second motive ends, and sure enough, it's to B flat major. I should briefly mention that a cadence, when done with 4 to 5 to 1, is typically considered stronger than just 5 to 1. The 4 could be considered a preparatory chord for the 5, also known as the predominant. So let's look at our entry section now. So this entry section is fairly straightforward given what we've seen so far. First, we have a real answer on 4, which is B flat, our current key. So we're just playing the 1 of our current key, but the 4 of F. Immediately after this answer is over, we lose the E flats again, and then we get the subject back played by the flute. So we're back in the key of F. This is an interesting progression to note, because we didn't really do a cadence to get there, nor did we really have a pivot chord. Instead, Bach took advantage of the inverse relationship of B flat and F. So B flat is the 4 of F. If we count up F, G, A, B flat, that's 4. But if we look at it another way, if we look at it from the key we were just in of B flat, and we count up from B flat, C, D, E flat, F, that's 5. So F is the 5 of B flat. So in this case, Bach took advantage of this relationship by doing something very typical and playing the 5 of the key that we're currently in. And that 5 just so happens to be our original F and our original subject. And just like that, we're back to F. This subject is followed by a real answer on 5, which, since we're back in our original key, everything lines up, and it's also the 5 of our current key, and so it's C. Let's take a look at our final episode that leads to our ending. So our episode is brief, and we see a couple of motives that we've encountered before. The second motive that descends, and the 16th note sequencing pattern that we first saw in our codetta that functioned as the tail to that motive. We briefly see some E flats, which might indicate that we're tonicizing or going to 4 again, or B flat major. But right before the subject head comes back in, we actually do a quick cadence. 4, 5, 1, which would normally sound pretty conclusive for the end of the piece, but then Bach does a plagal cadence to finish off the piece. And a plagal cadence is going directly to 1 from 4. It has less of a final sound, but it's typically done after a normal cadence of 4, 5, 1, as sort of an addendum to the piece to really drive the ending home. This little extra ending after a 4, 5, 1 cadence at the end is known as a coda. And the coda is what we see here that encompasses the head of the subject. I hope that you find this analysis video helpful in some way, whether it's the introduction of some of the musical concepts or just getting a little bit better of an understanding of how a piece like this operates. If you'd like to hear the piece in full, I highly recommend checking out the Freiburger Barockorchester performance on the EuroArts channel. I'll provide a link to this in the description. It's a very well done performance, and they've kindly allowed me to use their audio and some of their video in this.